Joel.
Hey,
how's it going?
It's been a little bit.
It has been a little while.
Yep.
But there's nothing been going on in the meanwhile.
Not at all. We've just been sitting around doing nothing.
You're right. Yes.
Yeah.
No, wait a minute.
Did you have a nice Christmas?
I did. I had a great Christmas.
Yeah.
Good time. I had 3 weeks off, which is really, really nice. It's one
amazing.
of those. It's normally not in that long, but it's a good year for us in that way. And I had a really great time writing my doctoral dissertation over that break.
Awesome.
I really wish I had just a couple more weeks to just see it through, because I got to write over 80 pages in those 3 weeks.
Wow.
So I was really pleased with that.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot. Yeah.
What's been going on with you lately?
Yeah, so I did not have 3 weeks off. I had 3 of the busiest weeks of the year. So between Advent and Christmas Eve and Christmas, we were also had a daughter getting married, which was amazing and wonderful. And I'm biased, but I think it was the best wedding I've ever been to.
I was there, and it was a pretty good wedding.
Yeah, I thought, they ended up married, so we consider it a success, right? I ran an ultra during that time, first one in a long time, and then was getting ready for a new semester to start, and doing a lot of reading, end of the year, beginning of the year, and kind of getting ready for the rush at the beginning of the year, which for me includes a lot of travel and different things.
Yeah. Speaking of reading, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, so lately I've been reading a lot of Plato and Aristotle for some of the academic work that I'm doing. Over the break, I was reading David Copperfield, which for many, many years was my third favorite novel of all time. It's probably fallen down on the list a little bit, but I think this was the first time I've read the book in probably 15 years. And it was so enjoyable. I was laughing out loud really throughout the reading, and even though I've read it multiple times before, it was like reading it again for the first time, just because it had been so long. So really enjoyed that.
Who knew that a book about a magician could be that interesting?
Not about a magician. Yeah, Charles Dickens novel.
Oh,
Yeah.
That one.
Yes. Yeah.
I knew that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The one with the downtrodden, troubled orphan. The only Dickens novel.
Yeah, right. That one.
Yeah. That one. Yeah.
It's like that episode of Three's Company where there's some sort of misunderstanding.
I never watched Three's Company.
No, you wouldn't like it.
What have you been reading? Just watching Three's Company.
Yeah, obviously. No, I haven't watched that in years. I've been reading lots of pieces of books. Obviously, as you're writing a dissertation, you're reading a lot of kind of syntopically, looking for themes and great ideas that fit in there. But for my work, with the students, we're reading Odyssey right now.
Nice.
We're reading Herodotus, which is a whole lot of fun. I'm kind of pre-reading before I get to it with my students four Platonic dialogues, kind of the last days of Socrates, starting with Euthyphro, which is, I've read Euthyphro, I don't know how many times. I love Euthyphro. It's one of the most interesting, and I think one of the best places to actually start reading Plato.
Agreed.
Just because it is a short read. It's a fairly easy to understand read, right? So
interesting.
Very interesting.
Humorous in places, and kind of a dark humor.
Yeah, well,
I think it's humorous.
The more I read Plato, the longer I've read Plato, the more I realize how big of a jerk Socrates is.
Very much so.
Like no holds barred. So
having some sympathy with those that wanted to put him to death.
Yeah. But it's enjoyable. It speaks to my unsarcastic side.
There you go. There you go. Fantastic.
Well, what are we talking about today?
One of our favorite pieces by C.S. Lewis. We said that probably every fourth or fifth episode of this podcast is going to revert to something by Lewis. And so today we're reading Abolition of Man.
Abolition of Man.
Yeah. So what is Abolition of Man, by the way? Are we dealing with a book? Are we dealing with something else that has kind of been published as a book? What is this?
Well, Abolition of Man is kind of C.S. Lewis's treatise on the move of education away from classical education, focusing on virtue, to the more modern ideals of education, which focus more upon practical production type things. And there's really this kind of relativistic idea that he's interacting with in particular that's rising up in his own day,
right?
Which I would say is kind of full blown in our own day.
Yes. Yeah, one of the important works that he contributed in terms of dealing with modernism and the fruits of modernity, in the same way that Chesterton had a generation earlier, in the same way that Machen was dealing with that, just after and contemporary with Chesterton. And yeah, I do think we see that in full bloom. So a three-part work that wasn't really written as a book, but kind of three essay/lectures that are put together into book form and have had just a profound influence on many people, and certainly those who love Lewis. But this work, being a piece of nonfiction philosophy and analysis, has kind of a counterpart in Lewis's canon among his works of fiction. And maybe we should mention that at some point, that Abolition of Man is really a nonfiction presentation of the ideas that you see dramatized in That Hideous Strength.
Right. Yeah, the third installment of the Ransom Trilogy.
Right.
Which should be read third.
Ideally.
Line. Yeah.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about
that unless you can't read the first two first, in which case Lewis would say That Hideous Strength could be read alone.
What circumstance is that? I'm dying the next day, so I can't read the first two first?
I mean, and it's not a bad idea to read That Hideous Strength and then read the trilogy in its entirety.
Why would you do that? Why would you do that?
That's not what I do.
Then why are you suggesting that people do that?
Because Lewis put it in the preface. It's in the preface to the novel. Are you ready to get started?
I thought we did.
I thought we did too, but I feel like we need kind of a reset moment. So I still want to be friends.
All right, let's talk specifically about the book.
Death can't hold you, no, it won't hold you. Death can't hold you in that grave, no. Death can't hold you, no, it won't hold you. I know you've risen and you reign in me. Yes, you reign in me.
So I do think that Abolition of Man, as far as his nonfiction works go, and like you said, it wasn't published initially as a book. Actually, a lot of people may not know this, but Mere Christianity also was not originally a book.
Radio
it's a
addresses.
series of radio broadcasts during World War II. So he's got a few books that came about by some non-traditional means. But regardless, as far as it goes, I think this is probably his most important nonfiction book. That'd be my argument. Now, I would say that at least that is at least accessible on a non-scholarly level, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
it's a tough read. It's a tough read for some people, for sure.
Yeah.
But I'm not Discarded Image and some of the his more academic medieval type work. That's maybe another question, but.
Yeah, no, I didn't expect you to say that, but I'm not going to argue with it. You could certainly make a case for it, and I think it is more accessible, or on the more accessible end of his academic works.
Right.
Lewis really, he's writing at a popular level. Not everything that he writes is at a popular level, but the majority of his canon is accessible to the lay reader who wants to be informed and who's growing more informed as he reads Lewis.
I may have a bias because I am an educator, right?
Yeah.
And everything he says here hits so close to home
Absolutely.
for me about what I value as a classical Christian educator.
Absolutely.
Right? So I have a heart for what he says here. But.
It's one of the books that we ought to be reading while we watch the world burn, and specifically Western civilization kind of slit its own wrists. Back in 2020, I made a list of books to read while the world burned.
Some men just want to watch the world burn.
And this definitely should be on it. And by that, I mean books that help us understand where we are in history and kind of understand the cultural moment that provide some insight. So you would have some nonfiction works that kind of provide analysis, like Abolition does, and then I think you'd have some works of fiction that help you learn how to navigate the moment, and That Hideous Strength would certainly be on that list.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the opening line of the book says, "I doubt whether we are sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary textbooks."
You do realize that you skipped two important pieces by jumping to the first line.
Okay, well, that's probably fair. Would you like like to correct me. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the title of part 1 is Men Without Chests. And I have a few, like, that evokes a few thoughts in this transgender madness moment,
Yeah.
which is not what Lewis is
Didn't have
talking
that in
about
mind.
at all. And yet,
Sometimes the prophets don't know what they're prophesying about.
exactly, right? You know, he is anticipating the kind of cultural trends and currents that would bring us to this current moment. But anyway, Men Without Chests is going to be kind of a thematic statement for part 1,
Right.
and the closing line of part 1 is just
Phenomenal.
Yeah, and it will help explain what that means. But then each of the 3 parts includes kind of this introductory quote, as many books do. And this one is from a traditional carol, which says, "So he sent the word to slay and slew the little childer," right? The little children,
Right.
We would say. And that's really what part 1 is about, is sending a word that would destroy the youth. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, take us to the first line now.
Yes. Thank you. I doubt whether we are sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary textbooks. I just want to say right off the bat, having read this book, I don't know how many times at this point.
More than once.
A lot more than once. I couldn't agree more with that statement, and it's been interesting to me over the years, especially because I'm into apologetics. I love Christian apologetics, and even though I'm a Reformed guy, I even love classical apologetics and evidentialism, and I'm kind of a precept all of it together kind of guy. But regardless, in the world of apologetics, there's been a lot of talk over the last 20 years about how many youths are leaving the church, and they have all these statistics about 75% of church students go out into the world and never come back to the church. And I mean, I would argue against those statistics on a number of ways, but regardless, so much of apologetics is focused on college ministries or reaching college-age students and warning families against the dangers of universities and so on and so forth. And the conviction that I have come to over the years, and which I think Lewis is pointing us to right here, is that if you think this is about college or like making sure something doesn't go wrong at college, you've waited way too long to engage.
Absolutely.
The fight is so much earlier than college.
Yeah. The loss of faith and the eventual apostasy of our youth is only the flowering of something that was planted, tares that were planted in their heart long before. I think the interesting thing here is the idea of elementary school textbooks, right? These elementary textbooks for elementary age children. All of our children were homeschooled, and for most of their education, not all, but most of their education, it was kind of a whole book or classical approach, right? Especially the boys, we went to a more explicitly classical model. But even when they were using whole book studies for most of their subjects, we would have at least a couple of textbooks, maybe a math textbook, maybe a science textbook, but just the idea that the textbook is the best vehicle for training young minds is an idea that I would want to dispute, right? And not because I don't think textbooks have a place, right? But at the same time, when that is the primary media of education, you're not getting truth in context. You're getting truth kind of in summary and in sound bites, and you're getting it sanitized from a particular ideological perspective, for good or bad, right? Maybe it's written from a Christian standpoint. Maybe it's written from, kind of a Western tradition standpoint. I would say that would be good. But even some of those things that are packaged and prepared and promoted from a Christian or Western tradition standpoint, you find out there's poison, there's death in the pot, you know. And so even the idea of saying, we're going to simply give these children kind of uncritically the curriculum that has been developed and marketed for their age, and then that's their education. We have been insufficiently attentive to how significant those influences are at that age.
Yeah, and again, especially at the elementary age, right? Or some might call it the grammar school age or something along those lines. I think a lot of people think as well, at that point, all you're doing is talking about, how to diagram a sentence, 2 plus 2 is 4. There's no philosophy in that. There's there's nothing dangerous. It's just the basics. And what Lewis does in this book is show us how that's really not always the case.
Right.
That as people set out to, at least say they set out to pursue a certain topic, what they say or what they don't say sometimes is loaded with all kinds of other ideas.
Yeah, it's always a question of what are the underlying assumptions of the system, what are the principles that are being advanced, and even if the information that's being shared seems innocuous, the way in which it's presented, right, the presuppositions that it's built upon, that makes a huge difference in terms of the worldview that these young people cultivate, or have presented to them that they then choose to adopt.
So Lewis has got a hold of a textbook.
Right.
He calls it the Green Book.
Right.
You can find out what book this is, but we won't worry about that right now.
Right. Yes.
He gives it some anonymity, and he even protects the guilty a little bit, right, by calling them Gaius and Titius. So Joel, tell me a little bit, what is this book? What do they say that they're proposing to do?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut off the question. He says this is a little book on English intended for, quote, boys and girls in the upper forms of schools. And so it's supposed to be an English book, like grammar, literature, kind of thinking about the English language and everything that goes along with that. And, as we've said several times before, whoever controls the dictionary controls the conversation.
Right.
And that's what you're seeing in the way that Lewis begins to kind of critically analyze this text, to say even the ways that it is analyzing linguistic issues actually is uncovering some much deeper philosophical assumptions that really are, toxic to a virtuous perspective.
Yeah. So let me read a little section of this to kind of set up our conversation. So he is discussing the Green Book, and the authors Gaius and Titius are kind of retelling a story that, although not familiar to maybe a lot of modern readers, was familiar to many people in the day, about Coleridge at the waterfall. Right. It says, you remember that there were 2 tourists present, that one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as follows: when the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Mm. So, what stands out to you about that, Joel? What is going on here? What is the problem that Lewis is trying to, and he'll of course unpack it more, but what is he pointing at? Yeah,
the two authors, are doing something that does not immediately appear to be sinister and might appear to be kind of clever, right? It could kind of catch your attention and say, oh, I've never thought about it from that standpoint. He's not describing the waterfall. He's describing the impression that the waterfall is making upon him. But what that actually does is it shifts the meaning of the statement and relativizes not only that statement, but as it turns out, everything, so that now there is no objective reality. There's no objective beauty to be perceived. There are no objective truths to be recognized and then affirmed. Everything is reduced to kind of the subjective, personal, relativistic level, and that's poison in the well that then begins to influence everything. It's not just about one story, about Coleridge. It really is fundamentally reshaping, recreating a person's worldview.
Yeah. And it may be helpful to our listeners because some people have a background in philosophy and talk about the stuff that you and I like to talk about all the time, and some don't. But when we say things like objective versus subjective, what do we mean by that? I mean, objective is this idea that external of the self,
Yes.
there is a reality.
Yes.
And that reality is what it is, and our will or feelings about it have absolutely no impact, or they cannot change that external reality of the objective world. So, a lot of naturalists would say, well, I believe in the objective world, it's the physical stuff, that tree is real and that, but what they would maybe push back against is when you make something like we would call value judgments.
Right.
To say that is a good man, right? That is a beautiful sunset. At that point, they would maybe object and say, you're no longer actually talking about the objective world, the world external to you. You're talking about the subject, yourself, and how you feel about the things you see. But why is it, how does Lewis show us that by no means is actually what we're doing when we say something like that waterfall is sublime?
Yeah, I mean, he deals with this at a philosophical level, but first he kind of addresses just like the linguistic, most basic level of saying the man who says that is sublime is not saying that feeling that I have is sublimity, right? It's that waterfall. Right. That is the sublime thing. That there is a statement, that there is an assessment, that there is a proposition, and the predicate, right? Yes. That's the key, right? Is to say what is being affirmed and what is the predicate of that affirmation, that proposition, right? And then he goes deeper than that, but just at the most basic level. It's like, do words have meaning or not, right? Do statements have meaning or not? Is, if we were to say kind of this radical relativism that, perception is reality, which is just demonstrably not true, right? I don't perceive that I have cancer, therefore I don't have cancer, until a doctor comes and says you have cancer, and you say, well, I don't feel like I have cancer, and he says, it's interesting but irrelevant, right? You're right, though. The place where people want to become radical relativists is in the place of value judgments, and at a superficial level they think they can make an argument for that, to say, I think chocolate ice cream is superior to vanilla ice cream, and all it is just kind of this subjective impression that I have. But they're missing, and that's I think what Lewis is getting here, is they're missing the real objective, transcendent, external truth that value judgments are supposed to align with, right? It's perfectly fine for me to have a preference, right? We're not talking about me being able to have a preference and say that, I think pickles are the result of the fall, right? But we're talking, that, I don't know, that might be an objective universal as well. But anyway, but we're not to say that there's no such thing as actual truth when it comes to external assessments of reality.
Yeah, and he does a good job refuting this as well when he says, even on their own view, or on any conceivable view, the man who says this is sublime cannot mean I have sublime feelings. And he can skip down a little bit. He says, the feelings which make a man call an object sublime are not sublime feelings, but feelings of veneration, right?
Yes.
So what they seem to be saying is that, you stand before this waterfall, or you could put it a mountaintop experience, or the edge of the ocean, or whatever kind of grand scenery you might like to imagine, and you say, this is sublime, this is magnificent. They're saying that what you're actually saying is that you feel magnificence, and yet he's saying that that's the exact opposite of what you actually feel. Exactly. And anybody who's had the experience of standing on the edge of the ocean for the first time, you don't feel personally sublime or magnificent. You feel small.
Exactly.
You feel tiny, right? And in fact, the idea of sublime, that's a word that's maybe lost on a lot of people today, but the idea of the sublime is actually a transcendence of self, where you basically forget you exist.
Right.
Right?
It's been sublimated.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And so whatever you mean, it can't be that.
Right.
It just can't be that.
Exactly.
That makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and so he deals with that just kind of like the linguistic fallacy of this analysis, this kind of, this kind of approach to deconstructing that statement. Then he deals with, this is on page 6, before considering the philosophical credentials of the position, which they have adopted about value, I should like to show its practical results on the educational procedure. And he kind of demonstrates, hey, this is not only fallacious just in terms of, the meaning of language, but it's also corrosive to what they claim to be trying to do, and that is educate children. And he has a further illustration. And then he gets into, the more profound philosophical questions about, truth, goodness, and beauty, essentially, and its objective reality.
Yeah, here on page 5, he says, the very power of Gaius and Titius depends on the fact that they are dealing with a boy who thinks he is doing his English prep and has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. Mm-hmm. It is not a theory they put into his mind, but an assumption, which 10 years hence, its origin forgotten and its presence unconscious, will condition him to take one side in a controversy which he has never recognized as a controversy at all.
Right.
And that's, the insidious thing about this. And Lewis does much to try to say that he doesn't necessarily think the authors are trying to intentionally do this, although who knows.
Yeah, and I want to come to that in a second. Yeah.
But at the same time, the power, it does lie in this fact that what can be made to be just a simple assumption, a quietly assumed thing, can radically change the course of a person's trajectory if it's not examined.
Exactly, and that is because, as the quote that you read, he has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. That's because philosophy, right? Ethics is a branch of philosophy. Right. Philosophy, theology, and politics, right? Not to be controversial here, but it's just true. Philosophy, theology, and politics are all inescapable. They are all inevitable. Right? R.C. Sproul, several years before his death, wrote a book called Everyone is a Theologian. John Frame, several years ago, wrote a book called We Are All Philosophers, right? And if you understand the actual meaning of politics, right, that which pertains to the city, that which pertains to the human community, the human society, well, those ideas are bound up in everything. You don't have value-neutral zones of conversation or inquiry. You do not have any neutrality. It doesn't exist. Yeah. So you're operating from a particular worldview. You're operating with a particular set of presuppositions. And the way that you discuss anything is the way that, given enough time and eventual consistency, you will view everything. Right? That's what Lewis is saying, is that, this child is being given a lesson in the English language, right? No, he's not. He's being given a lesson in philosophy. Oh, by the way, a lesson in theology. Oh, by the way, a lesson in politics, right? Yeah. Political science. And it's inevitable. It's inescapable. And the way that you discuss anything is eventually how you will begin to view everything. Or, and maybe this is kind of leads us to the second part of the conversation that you just set up. Even if it's not the way that I will come to view it, it's the way that my offspring, my intellectual offspring will. In other words, ideas have consequences, to mention the title of another important book, right? Richard Weaver. Ideas have consequences, and they bear fruit over time. And so you see what I would say are false teachers, false prophets, right? Snakes in the garden, who are introducing ideas that they may or may not be conscious of, that they may or may not have malice with regard to its application. They may or may not take it to its actual fruition, but their offspring, intellectually, right, philosophically, theologically, politically, those who are downstream from them and influenced by those ideas, they will.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about on page 6 and 7. He again addressing the Green Book, and what they try to do is compare what they say is, well, not so much compare, but they take a piece of literature and tell you why it's bad literature.
Right.
So when in their attempt to do that, what is it that they're doing exactly? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I was actually going to ask a clarifying question.
Okay.
Are you thinking about the advertisement?
Yeah, the
and
advertisement.
Then,
Talking about where Drake and Devon sailed. The Western Ocean, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What is their critique of that piece?
Yeah. Well, so I don't even know how to summarize this without reading a little bit of it. So he says the advertisement tells us that those who buy tickets for this cruise will go across the Western Ocean where Drake of Devon sailed, adventuring after the treasures of the Indies and bringing home themselves also a treasure of golden hours and glowing colors. Lewis then comments. He says it is a bad bit of writing, of course, a venal and pathetic exploitation of those emotions of awe and pleasure which men feel in visiting places that have striking associations with history or legend. If Gaius and Titius were to stick to their last and teach their readers, as they promised to do, the art of English composition, it was their business to put this advertisement side by side with passages from great writers in which the very emotion is well expressed, and then show where the difference lies. Mm-hmm. But that's not what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So their problem, it seems to me, is that this tells you things that are not factually true. Right. So they're saying this is bad writing because it's really not the case that you're going to sail exactly where Drake sailed,
or
right?
come home
with golden
treasure,
hours or whatever they say. Like as if so you should dismiss this because it's not literally true. Lewis says you should dismiss this because it's trash writing. It's like it's just poorly written.
Right.
Whereas on the other hand, he kind of goes on and says they might have used Johnson's famous passage from the Western Islands, which concludes that man is little to be envied whose patriotism would not gain force upon the plain of Marathon, or whose piety would not grow warmer among the ruins of Iona. They might have taken that place in the Prelude, where Wordsworth describes how the antiquity of London first descended on his mind with weight and power growing under weight.
Right.
So Lewis is saying what they should have done is they should have said, here's this advertisement. It's cheesy.
Yeah.
It's badly written.
Right.
It's not the way, if you want to sell somebody on a cruise, don't do it like that. Right. Do it like this, right?
Yeah.
And so, but the thing is, the way the Green Book is critiquing things, it would critique Johnson and Wordsworth the exact same way.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
They're not actually able to recognize this is a higher form of literary quality.
Right.
Their critique is going to be the same. It's going to be, but that's not literally true. What do you mean by weight?
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. You may have seen the headline. I saw it today that a high school has put basically a warning label on a Jane Austen novel. That caution it has gendered stereotypes in it. And it's not exactly the same thing, but I think about that kind of thing whenever I read this passage, is to say, you talk about like missing the whole point. Yeah. Okay, that's swing and a miss, right? Yeah, Lewis is saying two things can be true at once, right? That could be a piece that ought to be critiqued, but it's not contemptible. It's not cringeworthy for all of the reasons that you think it is, and the reasons that you think it's a problem actually are a much bigger problem, and it doesn't say anything about the advertisement. It says something about you. It says something about your inability to understand the things that you're reading and to properly assess the world in which you live, right?
Yeah. I love that Lewis, when he's talking about this, he says, if they had done this correctly, if they had placed good writing next to bad writing,
right.
There would have been some blood and sap in it, the trees of knowledge and of life growing together.
Of course, that's not literally true.
No.
Yeah, that's.
But it's an interesting picture, isn't it?
It's a very powerful. I mean, this idea of imagery, metaphor, simile, analogy, mythology as a means of communicating, transcendent reality. Like, they just don't have categories for these things. Right. And Lewis, he can't communicate any other way.
Yeah, he's the king of analogy.
Absolutely.
So let's see here on page 9, he kind of talks about the trousered ape.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the trousered ape.
Folks, if you have an ape at home, make sure that he wears trousers.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's not the point.
So let's see if I can find the exact part I want here. So he's just, so he says he will, speaking about the schoolboy who has undergone
this kind of indoctrination.
Yeah. He will have no notion that there are two ways of being immune to such an advertisement, so an advertisement like the one with Drake sailing and all that,
Right.
That it falls equally flat on those who are above it and those who are below it,
Yep.
on the man of real sensibility and on the mere trousered ape who has never been able to conceive of the Atlantic as anything more than so many million tons of cold salt water.
Now I have it on good authority that that's what the Atlantic actually is made out of,
It
right?
is.
Millions of gallons of cold salt water.
I think it's incontestable.
And yet, even in your world, that is only what the ocean is made of. It's not what it actually is.
Right.
Yeah. And just to borrow and paraphrase another Lewis book. This is fascinating because, the inoculation against banality in advertisements and marketing is either to be educated to a higher kind of intellectual perception, or to fall beneath it to the place where you're basically a beast wearing clothes. And isn't this fascinating? I mean, this relates to other things that we talk about frequently, that the Bible portrays those who are made in the image of God, but not living out the image of God, not loving the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, strength, and mind, and pursuing truth, goodness, and beauty, and conformity to the image of Christ, and godly dominion, and all of those things. They become like beasts. They become like mere beasts. Yeah. And of course, that is what modernity has bequeathed us, is the idea that human beings are not image bearers, but they are simply verbal primates.
Right.
They're highly evolved monkeys, for all intents and purposes, that wear trousers. Yeah. And Lewis is saying, they're not entirely wrong about that. That's what this education essentially produces, is either people who are easily controlled by such advertisements, or people who are completely insensible, and it goes right past them and they don't even know what it is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you think about the Atlantic Ocean, sitting on the shore of the Atlantic Ocean, and you think about a dog maybe that's there, right? And is the dog sitting there and having its breath taken away by the view? No, it's probably kind of walking along the shore hoping that guy ahead of him drops that hot dog he's eating,
Right. Right.
It just doesn't have any effect. And so, when we sit on the edge of the ocean, I mean, to just literally think of it, it's just a bunch of cold salt water. I mean, right. What should we be feeling? What should we be thinking? Yeah. I mean, this should elicit all kinds of things to the well-trained heart. Things from, I wonder what things swim in the deep, right? I want, or even thinking about it mathematically or scientifically, what finding new species and things like that.
Sure.
Or what if it's, I wonder how many pirate battles went on just off the shore. You know what I mean? Just this kind of imaginative. Yeah. These are all, these are experiences that are like canvases for our imagination to paint on, right? That we should be just drawn into wonder and awe. And so for somebody to actually stand on the ocean side or on top of a mountain and just kind of go, whatever,
Right. Check my phone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You've seen, I'm sure you've probably seen that there's a picture that's gone around quite a bit now of a whole tour of teenagers in the Louvre sitting in front of a Rembrandt all looking at their phone.
Oh, no, I haven't seen that.
And it's like, why? It's just brutal.
Oh.
But it's that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what this educational system has produced, right? I mean, Lewis is talking about this educational system basically in the days of those people's grandparents, right? And now fast forward 2-3 generations, here we are, right? That kids are looking at their smartphones and at Facegram and Instabook when they're sitting in the midst of, beautiful, historic, amazing artifacts, right, of culture.
So right after the example of the Atlantic Ocean and the trousered ape, he also says, there are two men to whom we offer in vain a false leading article on patriotism and honor. One is the coward, the other is the honorable and patriotic man. What's the difference? Why is one above and one below in that case?
Yeah. You're talking about the coward and the patriot.
Yeah. Why are they both unaffected by that kind of an article?
Yeah. Well, again, because one has had his senses trained to discern good and evil, right? And not only between good and evil, but between that which is good and that which is excellent. right? He has his senses trained to be able to perceive what is good, right, true, lovely in this world. And the other person who is insensible. He's basically a walking vegetable. Yeah. He lives an unexamined life. He does not think critically because he doesn't know how. He doesn't even conceive of that being possible. He doesn't perceive what he doesn't have, right? He doesn't know what he doesn't know. He doesn't recognize that there is more than just the mere existence that he lives in. Right?
Yeah, the convinced coward will never be moved by a patriotic article.
No.
Oh, I'm not going to risk my life. You're talking about? I'm not going to do that, right? Whereas the truly patriotic man who believes in the good of his own country, fighting for his family, doesn't even need that article.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Point me at the bad guys when the bad guys need gotten.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
so there's just two different kinds of people there. All right, so moving along.
I want to note something at the bottom of page 9, and forgive me if I'm anticipating where you're going, but Gaius and Titius, while teaching him nothing about letters, have cut out of his soul, long before he is old enough to choose, the possibility of having certain experiences which thinkers of more authority than they have held to be generous, fruitful, and humane. Now, we passed over on page 5 or 6 the question of, do these men know what they're doing? Are they doing it on purpose? Are they simply ignorant of the havoc that they're wreaking?
Right.
Or are they diabolical? Right? And I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Setting that aside, here's the reality of what they've done. Among other things, they've robbed the children who have been indoctrinated under their tutelage. They've robbed those children of truth, goodness, and beauty.
Yeah.
They've robbed those children of being able to sit at the ocean and experience awe, or reading a poem and experiencing joy, or being moved by a great work of literature, moved to tears, right? They've robbed them of all that. They've cut out of their soul their ability to experience that. You think about the kinds of, again, not to change the subject, but I think it is the fruit of this folly and wickedness. The transgender madness that we're living in the midst of right now. We're cutting out, quite literally, biological and reproductive fruitfulness from young people, right? And there's going to be hell to pay for that, and I mean that. At the same time, something ideologically, soulishly, spiritually happened before. And what we are doing today, we never would have been able to do if this part of the soul hadn't been cut out.
Right.
Because when that part of the soul is intact, you could not even contemplate doing the kinds of things we're doing to young people now.
Yeah.
The fact that we're able to do it is pretty clear proof that Lewis's analysis was right, and that 2 or 3 generations ago, that part of the soul was removed from their ancestors.
Yeah. And this touches on something he gets into later in the book, but I'm going to go ahead and mention it now anyway. But one thing that people say a lot when in education circles is they talk about indoctrination, right? So everybody's favorite thing to do is accuse the other side of indoctrinating children, right? My response to that, maybe this is controversial, but is like, yeah, no, duh.
Right.
Like education. Do you know what the word doctrine is? It's,
indoctrinate.
Right,
think about it.
Yeah, it's teaching, right? I mean, so yes, I am indoctrinating children, and so is everyone, right?
Exactly.
The biggest question is not, are we indoctrinating children? It's what are we indoctrinating them with, and why?
Yes.
Towards what end? And so the issue here is, am I indoctrinating children with something because I want them to do something that I believe will benefit me, will benefit society at large, benefit them personally, some combination, but the issue is that, and he gets into this in the second part of the book, if you don't believe that there is an actual good,
right,
like an objective moral standard, right, then your reason for indoctrinating children is wicked. I mean,
is
it
monstrous.
can't be anything but wicked.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Whereas if you believe that there is an objective good, a good that you didn't make,
Right.
but that which you are personally subject to, as are all people,
Right.
and your hope is to indoctrinate children to love what is good,
Right.
for their own good, for the glory of God,
Yep.
for the good of society,
Right.
right? That's a whole different thing.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously we recognize that indoctrination has kind of a pejorative,
Negative,
very negative connotation, and not trying to lean into that at all, but to recognize indoctrination is inevitable. It's inevitable. And so it's not a question of whether, it's a question of which kind of indoctrination.
Right.
What kind of indoctrination?
What's your motive for
Why
doing it that way?
are exactly, and that is all education. And oh, by the way, there's no such thing as an uneducated person. Like Chesterton has a great essay about this that maybe we should bring into the conversation at some point. But the uneducated person is a myth. He doesn't exist. This is a fiction, right? The kid that is the truant and in a street gang who's never been to school a day in his life has been thoroughly indoctrinated, right? And so the question is the education that you are giving to young people imparting to them truth, objectively, universally, externally, goodness, right? Absolutely, morally understood, and beauty, not just a subjective impression of how that makes me feel or think, but objectively, really, demonstrably, inarguably, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and I know that I thought this way at once too, so I don't want to kind of play the judgment card
Sure.
here, okay? But it bothers me how many even convictionally Christian folks I talk to who would say, "Oh, beauty really is just in the eye of the beholder," which is that's an actual lie. Like, it's just absolutely not true, right? Beauty is an objective reality. Like you can actually say, "Oh, I don't think that's beautiful," and be wrong.
Correct.
And so even a lot of Christians will say, well, I mean, I believe truth is objective, and I believe morality is objective, but they want to hold back on that third area of value judgment, right? And yet it belongs to the same realm.
I apologize if I'm flashing forward here, but if I recall correctly, it's in part 3 that Lewis says, I don't particularly enjoy the company of small children. Mm-hmm. And what that tells me is that there's a defect in me. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But he doesn't say, therefore, the company of small children is not objectively beautiful, wonderful, something praiseworthy. He says, no, that tells you that there's something broken in me. Yeah. I'm like the man who is colorblind. I'm like the man who is deaf. I'm not perceiving the beauty in this case, the goodness in this case. But that's a me problem. Yeah. Right? That's not a statement about the objective reality or the lack thereof. It's a statement about my brokenness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see this all the time with students I've had over the years, who have grown up on a steady diet of Captain Underpants, right? And so we're reading.
Is that a real thing?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. Okay.
You're better off for not knowing. I mean, like, absolutely. But it's it's just it's what's passes for children's literature these days instead of quality things like Winnie the Pooh.
The more time I spend with you, the more I realize how uncultured I really am.
Well, that's not always a bad thing, right? But so they've read this kind of lowball children's literature that's just very slapstick at best and a lot of toot jokes, and that's kind of the whole And so, but then we come to a book and we read. We're gonna read Dante's Inferno. We're gonna read, Augustine's Confessions.
That's quite a jump, by the way.
I understand, but that's my. I
was anticipating where you were going. I didn't anticipate that one.
That's actually my point, though. Like, I mean, I've had plenty of students who, when I get them in 7th grade, probably haven't read much above that level.
Sure.
And then we step into there and I go, oh, I don't like this.
Right.
I hate, or even Tolkien, right? Reading Lord of the Rings, they're like, oh, he just
Tolkien?
Describes too much. It's just so, I don't like it, And they've had this steady diet of trash.
Right.
And so, but I always tell them, lovingly as possible, I'm like, the reason you don't love this is because something's broken in you, and we're going to try and fix it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if all you've done is eaten potato chips, right, and candy bars all your life, and hey, like, potato chips are good, right? Candy bars are good, and then you can't appreciate actual food. Mm-hmm. You can't appreciate, like, the food that God made. I don't want that. It doesn't taste good. You get that garbage out of your diet for a month, and then you go get some ripe fruit, right? You go get a nice piece of fish or a nice steak or you know what, and you start realizing, oh my, this is what food is supposed to taste like. Where I was going with that, I was thinking about the way that this is so often the case with poetry. How many times have you, especially if you don't have a habit of reading poetry, when you begin trying to read poetry, you read poetry and you say, it's confusing, it's weird, I don't know what's going on, I don't think it's particularly beautiful, I don't find any value in it. And then as you continue, you persist, you continue to read, you seek to know, you begin to understand what's actually going on, and suddenly, maybe that same poem that meant nothing to you has become now one of your favorite pieces of literature, right? And it's marvelous. Wasn't that passage amazing? And you couldn't perceive it because, again, of the defect in your senses, because of the indoctrination you've had.
Yeah, and again, I want to be really quick to say that's been me.
Sure.
I mean, I've been there, right?
Absolutely.
So when I first started reading fictional literature, because for a long time all I read was theology and philosophy. Mm-hmm. So the first time I read Canterbury Tales, I hated it.
Yeah.
I'm like, ugh.
Right.
It rhymes too much, or
right.
like there's just I felt like, what's the difference between that and Cat in the Hat? I had no idea, you know.
Yeah.
And so there's medicine for this.
Right.
But it needs to be steadily applied. It's kind of like when Wisdom shows up to Boethius in the prison, right? She has to kind of apply light ointments at first, you know? And so Consolation of Philosophy, by the way, one of my other just
very
favorite
important
works of philosophy.
Medieval work,
but anyway, so we need to be patient with people, and I can relate. So.
Read your children's stories. Mm-hmm. Read them good stories. That doesn't mean don't read them storybooks, but make sure that even the storybooks, they're getting a steady diet of great literature, right? Yeah. And Peter Rabbit, that's a great story, right? Winnie the Pooh, Frog and Toad, Wind in the Willows. There's some real value in some of these stories that are very accessible to children. And when they're young, read aloud to them the Chronicles of Narnia. Read aloud to them great literature. Read the Hobbit. Read A Christmas Carol, right? And introduce them to these ideas so that they grow up in a world not even being able to relate to what we're talking about. So that they say, I don't know what Joel and Jacob are talking about. Like the first time I read Canterbury Tales, I thought it was amazing. It's like, great. We didn't have a classical education, right? I was a voracious reader from the time I was super young, right? But a lot of the things I was reading were not particularly valuable. Now there were some things that were, and I'm very thankful for that. But it wasn't communicated to me in any kind of a systematic way. And so what we're always trying to do is build the next generation better, right? Give them what we didn't have.
Hey, I was nearly a public school dropout.
Yeah.
I think my high school GPA was something like a 1.6 when I graduated, or something. So whatever, absolute bare minimum.
Yeah.
So I'm sure any teacher that I were to run into today from my high school would just be a whole different story for them. They would be really shocked to see me maybe alive at that point.
Email us.
That's right. But you mentioned these great children's stories like Peter Rabbit and the Brer Rabbit, right? And many other things like that. So Lewis does talk about another author who he calls another pseudonym here, but Orbilius, who does some similar work to Gaius and Titius, and he kind of addresses some passages that use kind of anthropomorphic language about animals, right? And again, he seems to be judging them on the fact that they are not secundum literum. In other words, they're not actually literally talking animals, like that's not real, right? That seems to be the criticism.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Oh, darn it! I didn't know. Right?
Horses don't talk anymore.
We can talk about that too sometimes.
Lewis in the endnotes to this book does acknowledge that Orbilius's work is not as offensive to him as the Green Book. Although I don't. Maybe I just need to read the book more. I've read it quite a bit, but I find it just as offensive.
Well, let me say something about that. So here's what I think might be the difference.
Yeah.
Although I think there's still something to take issue with.
Sure.
Right. So in the case of the Green Book, they are actually saying you cannot predicate
Right.
onto that object. So you cannot say that waterfall is sublime.
Yeah.
Right? You just can't do it.
Right.
And that's false. We would say that's actually, they're wrong. Like, they're just flat out wrong.
There's no truth in that.
What Orbilius is saying is a little less than, because he's
agree.
actually right.
Yeah.
Like that animals, they don't talk, right?
Right.
So they're both critiquing kind of like this hyper literalism,
Right.
in the brochure about the the travel on the sea or whatever. But at the same time, this gets at what Lewis talks about as far as sentiment.
Yes.
And so what is it? What's the harm being done by
Right.
taking away such stories of talking animals?
Yeah, well, and before we go there, just real quick, I think you're right. I understand that objectively, what Gaius and Titius are doing is attacking the very foundations, right? So it's destroying the foundations of everything.
Yeah.
Orbilius is attacking one of the ramparts, right? He's not
right.
blowing up the basement. At the same time, I think one of the reasons what Orbilius does is so offensive to me, maybe as opposed to Lewis in his day, is he's really writing before the Frankfurt School is a thing, and before critical theory is a thing, and yet what Orbilius is doing is like proto-critical theory here, right? He says Orbilius chooses for debunking a silly bit of writing on horses where these animals are praised as the willing servants of the early colonists in Australia, and he's offended that, like, well, the horses are not willing servants, right? They're not participating in this work of colonization,
Right,
and it is you can almost feel, right, the next generation or the next couple of generations where they're going to talk about the oppression of the horses, in this imperial colonization, that's so morally egregious in a world where there's no absolute morality. Anyway, so it's just, for me, I think that's why I react to this one so much, is because we now see the flowering of that, but it obviously arises from the more foundational assault.
Yeah.
Right.
No, and that's true.
Yeah.
On page 11 here, kind of responding to this, Lewis says, much less do they learn of the two classes of men who are respectively above and below the danger of such writing, which we've kind of already talked about that, right? But the man who really knows horses are real, the man who really knows horses and really loves them, not with anthropomorphic illusions, but with ordinate love.
Yeah. Properly ordered love, right?
And the irredeemable ermine blockhead, to whom a horse is merely an old-fashioned means of transport.
Right.
And then he says this: some pleasure in their own ponies and dogs they will have lost, some incentive to cruelty or neglect they will have received.
Right.
This is, the ability to conceive of the idea of an animal speaking, of an animal having feelings and emotions that it might express, right, has a humane effect, not on the animal,
right,
but on you and I,
Correct.
on
Correct.
men like us, right? And of course, again, the person who raises horses for a living, he's not in any danger of reading Brer Rabbit and thinking, oh, maybe I can go have a conversation with Mr. Ed later,
Right. Right.
Hello, I'm Mr. Ed.
That's not the point. The point is that such stories will have a sentimental effect upon his heart, which makes him think of his horses in such a way that he can love them properly,
Right.
care for them as creatures, not abuse them, right?
Yes.
And see them as something more than mere transportation.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this whole approach to the world robs a person of the beauty of that world. We go out on a summer night, we hear the cacophony of tree frogs and bugs and owls and all of the wildlife that is that's singing, and we hear mating calls.
Yeah.
I mean, we just kind of go through a taxonomy of, that's this tree frog, that's this cicada, that's this, whatever. And it robs you of the magic of it. Nobody's going out looking at their dog or at their horse and saying, I bet you actually could talk if you wanted to, right?
Right.
But everybody who's got a relationship with the dog or a horse is looking at him sometimes and saying, you really want to say something, don't you? Right? It's like there's like a humane connection there, not because the animal is human, right? But because there are humane virtues that we are applying, that are being awakened as we're interacting with and showing mercy, right, to the life of our animals.
And again, it's the funny thing is like, who thought this needed to be said?
Well,
I mean, all of the thousands of years of literature in the past, right, where we've talked about animals in this way, or we've predicated upon waterfalls, right? Have people been confused about these issues before?
No, they haven't been confused, but this is the hubris of this approach, is to say, I am going to step in and I am going to correct the last 3,500 years of human thought. Yeah. I am the one who has come to set you free by showing you the emptiness, right, of the world in which you live. Yeah. Exposing the lie. And this is really what Lewis says at the end of this the paragraph that you were quoting from. That is their day's lesson in English, though of English they have learned nothing. Another little portion of the human heritage has been quietly taken from them before they were old enough to understand. They never even get to experience the magic of those stories, because now they can only read the story and say, well, that's just not right. Yes. Right? That's so ridiculous, right? They go out at night and they say, oh, this bug is looking for a mate. And it's like, you're destroying a beautiful moment here, right? But you don't know the moment's beautiful, right? And
of course, we talked about how the fictional literature of C.S. Lewis, we have that hideous strength, which is kind of a mirror of this text. But really, in numerous places in Lewis's fiction, you see mirrors of some of these things. Like, so, for instance, Eustace Clarence Scrubb is the product of just this kind of education.
Absolutely.
He's the kid who has butterflies and moths pinned to a board to study their taxonomy, but could never delight in the beauty of any of those butterflies. Right?
Correct.
And he's exactly that kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what Lewis does so well. He can think about these issues from an academic perspective, from kind of a very robust philosophical perspective, but he can also communicate these ideas in just powerful and provocative ways in literature, in fiction. And so if you're reading the Chronicles of Narnia carefully, if you're reading the Ransom trilogy repeatedly, then you're going to get all of these ideas, and you're going to come to the Abolition of Man, and you're going to say, yeah, exactly, right? Exactly. That makes sense. Whereas if you've not read those works, or not read them carefully, maybe you thought they were just, stories for children, then you're going to come to Abolition of Man, and you might be scratching your head a little bit, or struggling some with these concepts, or saying, well, what is he really getting at here?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Lewis says on page 12, I must for the moment content myself with pointing out that it is a philosophical and not a literary position. In filling their book with it, they have been unjust to the parent or headmaster who buys it, and who has got the work of amateur philosophers where he expected the work of professional grammarians.
Right.
This hits so close to home with our modern educational system right now.
Yep.
How many parents, I don't know how parents can still think this, but still, how many parents are sending their kids to the public school assuming their children are going to learn to read,
right?
They're going to learn to write, they're going to learn math, they're going to learn, biology, and they're going to learn chemistry, and what they're actually learning is gender identity issues and critical race theory, and so on and so forth, right? Now, again, those books may be labeled English 101 or something along those lines.
Yes.
But I mean, I went to one semester at a so-called Christian college, on campus, and my English class was all about feminism. Yeah. The entire thing. Of
course.
Right. I kind of miss the days where English class was about feminism at this point, because that's
for the good old days, right? When there were still women who didn't have beards, right?
Yeah. Now they would string up that lady for being so sexist.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, it's an excellent point, and this is really, this is quite a burn. I mean, like, Lewis is really in a muted way tearing up his interlocutors here. Yeah. Because he's saying you've committed an act of fraud all these parents, all these headmasters, all these instructors thought that they were getting a work of grammar, and what you've given them is like a third-rate work of ideology, and it's just not good. And this is not what you're being paid for, and this is not what anybody expected. And like, who asked you to do this? And again, I go back to the hubris of this whole project, right? I am going to now correct and sit in judgment of 3,500 plus years of human reflection upon truth. And I'm going to explain to you, that book's wrong. Horses don't really talk.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love it. I love it. He says, and he's considering like why they might do this. And he says, in the first place, literary criticism is difficult, and what they actually do is very much easier.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of truth to that. I mean, the actual setting a piece of literature before a student and trying to explain why this is poorly written, especially when you say, well, no, all the punctuation's in the right spot, right? Like it has a subject, a verb, and a predicate. Like, so it's written correctly. What do you mean it's not well written, right? Literary criticism that says, hey, we want to look at the word choice, the diction. We want to, and how this communicates, the emotion that's meant to be communicated. I mean, that's a difficult task to say this piece of literature is bad and this piece of literature is good. It's much more easy to go, hey, that's not literal, right?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And it's a cop-out, and by the way, I think that, we've danced around this and maybe we won't hit it square on, but, I think Lewis is overly charitable to these two authors. I really do, because he is very careful not to judge their motives, not to try and judge their heart. Maybe I'm too willing to do that. Whether they were intentional and malicious with this program, very clearly other people have been and are. Regardless, they've robbed their students. They've destroyed generations now. It's interesting, as he describes at the end of page 13 and the beginning of page 14, the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. I mean, that's a sentence we need to just like camp out on for a podcast, is to say the way that you correct false ideas is by instilling virtue. It's by instilling the right ideas. It's not just by saying horses don't talk, right? It's not by telling them what's wrong with this, but it's actually by showing them and leading them to what is good, right, and beautiful. He says, by starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. Yes. And that is ultimately what we have done. And that is what we see over the last several generations of public education, is that we are creating a citizenry that is easily controlled. We have given them a smartphone. We have given them, Facegram and Instabook and TikTok, and they are willingly enslaved. They are glad to be. Whereas if they had been properly introduced to truth, goodness, and beauty, there's nothing on social media that can compare with that, right? And I'm not just hating on social media. I'm sure it has a place, right? We need to exercise dominion there too. Somebody else can. I'm not going to.
Thanks for following us on Twitter, by the way, everybody, and YouTube.
Clearly, our channel is, one that's worth following. But the idea is that people have been prepared to be dominated, and it's because the virtues have not been awakened and shaped and refined and developed in their souls.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it's interesting. I think my wife is teaching right now Tom Sawyer, and when you think about the character in that book, he would be a case of a jungle needing cut back,
right?
Talk about active imagination to the extent of not being able to focus because he's just all over the place. Right. But that isn't really the norm. No. That we really do have this kind of arid landscape of lack of imagination, lack of wonder, lack of awe. And it just, the more we live in a generation that all they do is either sit in front of a television or sit in front of a smartphone, scrolling endlessly, looking at, meaningless 20-second videos, it's hard, very hard to get someone to take enough time to actually contemplate the beauty of a literary passage or a work of art, right?
Yeah.
Actually, I think, again, there are many balms that need to be applied, okay? But one of the things that I think is helpful is to actually force a student to sit and look at a great piece of art and write down observations.
Absolutely.
And then do it again.
Yeah.
And then do it again.
Yeah. Keep going back.
Do it again.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And because what they'll find is like, there was so much more to be curious about, right?
Yep.
But again, it's painful work.
Right. Well, it's amazing to me that, you know, I've been traveling a lot lately, and you know, lots of quick trips and airplane rides.
Quick trip, that reminds me to take a drink.
And you know, it's not just young people. I mean, I have never seen young people so as unmotivated, uninterested in the world as a lot of young people today. And I'm not trying to you know, talk down about young people. I mean, our church is full of wonderful young people. I know there are many wonderful, you know, kids.
People in their 40s and 50s just as disinterested.
This is what I was getting to. Is, you know, I'm on a plane a week and a half ago, and I'm sitting there, you know, reading Plato, and I'm in a middle seat, squashed between two people, like one of whom is older than I am, probably in his 50s, and the other who is certainly an adult. You know, he's in his late 20s, early 30s, and they're scrolling TikTok like the whole flight, not stopping.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, what is so fascinating, and you glance over and it's like a 20-second video, and it's just mindless. Like they're zombies, you know. I mean, I'm like, if the plane crashed, would they know that we went down?
Right.
You know.
Well, and get off that plane, see them by the luggage collect, you know, and say, hey, what were those videos about that you were watching?
No idea.
They have no idea.
No idea.
No idea.
It was just, and it, you know, it was just, you know, it was sad, you know, and it's not that, well, they should be sitting reading Plato or something like that, but it's just, it's to say this is what's filling your life. This is what's filling your time. You know, you're on a plane for an hour and a half, and it's consumed with 20-second, you know, video chunks. Yeah. That's it. You know, the emptiness, the lack of joy, the lack of, you know, the failing to encounter the transcendent, the noumenal, as Lewis will talk about in The Problem of Pain, is just, yeah, it's pervasive. It's pervasive in our culture now.
Right. Yeah.
We have the Green Book to thank for it, in part. Right.
So I want to talk just a little bit more about this. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments.
Yeah.
In my dissertation, and what I'm writing on in my dissertation is how stories are critical to helping each generation embrace virtue and to pass it on. Right. This is part of why stories are so important, is because they inculcate sentiment. They actually give models for students, for not just students, for everybody, to actually see the end of a virtuous life and the end of a vicious life.
Right.
And it creates what we might call moral imagination, the ability to imagine what it would be like if that were me, if I were in that place and doing that thing. And again, I think that, you know, whether it's social media or anything else, that people just spend so much time doing anything but building up the imaginative life.
Right.
I don't know. I'm not even sure I want to go with this, but I just, you know, I think it's sad. I just think it's really sad because I think you talk to so many people and they would say, if you ask them, what are you passionate about?
Right.
What do you really care about?
Right.
Like, I think you'd run into a whole lot of people that wouldn't even know what to answer, what to give you.
I think that's true. And you know, I was sitting here thinking as you were talking about that, about just knowing where you are in the story, which I think is also part of this, that stories are communicating to us, is that there are these great stories, these great ideas, these tremendous themes that are larger than we are, and that returning to them regularly helps us understand who we are and where we are, and that we are a part of something that's so much bigger than we are. And you're not going to get that, I'm sorry, on a social media feed. You're not going to get that living your life on YouTube. You're not going to get that just sitting and listening to a podcast, right? And I hope that our podcast is offering some substance. But again, like, what are we trying to get you to do here? Take up and read well, and read important books, read great books, and benefit from that.
So let's read another little bit here. So on the bottom of 14, kind of spilling on to 15, Lewis says, until quite modern times, all teachers, and even all men, believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. So much of modern pop psychology would tell you that, you feel how you feel, and how you feel is never wrong.
Right.
That is the exact opposite of what Lewis is saying.
Exactly. Yes.
So how are we to think about this idea that an object could merit a feeling in us, that it deserves to be felt a certain way?
It deserves to be perceived and to be recognized and to be affirmed as that which it is. The Grand Canyon is objectively, inarguably grand. And it ain't just because it's in the name, right? I mean, it has the right, in fact, not only the right, it demands that kind of awe. So much so that if you go to it and you say, nah, it's unimpressive. It's a hole in the ground, right? You've actually transgressed in a way, right? And I'm not trying to categorize this as a sin per se, but you've transgressed against something that is basic to the created order, right? That there are certain objects, yes. There are certain realities. There are certain events, experiences that have an objective, universal essence that demands acknowledgement. This is not an object, but just to kind of drill the point home, the Holocaust.
Yes.
You're not allowed to look at the Holocaust with indifference.
No.
You're not allowed to, right? And not because society tells you otherwise, but because it would be wrong, it would be immoral to be indifferent to it. Yeah. Well, I mean, we could think of a few other things that belong in that same category that merit contempt. And so that's what Lewis is talking about. This idea of truth, goodness, and beauty that is objective, that is universal, and that doesn't just receive my approval or disapproval. It demands. Yeah. It demands that I recognize it for what it is and that I say yes. Yes, right? And just one more idea about this. This is what you see in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whenever the demons come into proximity to Jesus. The demons always know who Jesus is. They always confess him. They always bow down to him or do some kind of obeisance. And they always submit to his command. Always. There's no exception to this. And what you would expect is that when the demons see Jesus coming, they would run away.
Right.
But instead you see demons afar off, Mark 5, run closer. The only time a demon doesn't confess who Jesus is in the Gospels is in Mark 9 when you have a mute spirit. Well, why are the devil's agents, right? The enemies of truth, the enemies of the Lord, why are they going around saying, this is the Holy One of God, bowing down before him, and when he casts them out, obeying him, right? It's because they can't do otherwise. Yeah. It's because he is who he is, and they perceive the reality of the Son of God in a way that men do not yet, right? So it's that kind of thing, is that inescapable, inarguable truth that demands recognition.
And so Lewis, he kind of swings back around to the initial illustration of Coleridge's The Waterfall.
Yep.
And so, up to this point, we've been talking about certain objects or certain issues or ideas demand a right response to them. But we could almost talk about that as just kind of this kind of binary black and white way. But he actually makes a point too that I think is really interesting, which is because the original story is that one person called it sublime, and one person called it pretty.
Right.
Now, first of all, some people are like, well, aren't those just synonyms? Well, they're not exactly.
Right.
Okay, like
Right.
sublimity has a lot more weight to
Yeah.
it. But one question we could ask is, was the person completely wrong to call it pretty?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is no.
No.
No, they weren't wrong to call it pretty. They just missed the mark of the best description.
Right.
Right. So just like if you're doing a mathematical sum, right, and the answer is actually 37, and you got 36 because you slightly miscalculated, right? Well, 37 is the correct answer. 36 was closer than if you had said 27.
Right.
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 So in the same way, evaluating the beauty of a waterfall, or how, if the issue of abortion, should I be mildly uncomfortable with that?
Right.
Should it bother me when I think about it?
Yeah.
Should I be infuriated that our country continues to allow that to happen? Right? Like, which of these sentiments is closest
Correct.
to the right one?
Correct. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important observation, and I think it depends a lot too on who is the person saying it's pretty. If that's a 4-year-old little girl that says that waterfall is so pretty, the answer is you're exactly right. And then we take them the next step.
Right.
If it's a 40-year-old man, say that waterfall's pretty, it's like, what is wrong with you? Like, are we looking at the same thing, dude?
Yeah.
Because we said a little while earlier that part of what forming virtue in this way involves is the ability to distinguish that which is good from that which is excellent.
Right.
And so it's this error of underestimation to say, that's nice, and it's like, no, like that's not just nice. That nice doesn't begin to describe it. Nice doesn't begin to do justice to it. It's not just pretty, but if it's a person who is on the path, if it's a person who would be expected to have kind of an immature perception of that reality, well then, yeah, we want to affirm that and then help them see how much more there is to see.
So one thing that Lewis brings up is that pretty much from as far back as we have recorded history and recorded literature throughout the centuries, really up until more or less the Enlightenment period, even across vastly different kinds of cultures, which you could spend a lot of time talking about the differences between not just the Greeks and the Romans, which are fairly similar, but the Chinese, right? The Chinese are very different in a lot of ways, right? And yet, he points out that there is this commonality in which that all education was thought to be about ordering the affections, ordering ordo amoris, like ordering the affections, so that children would come to rightly see the world as it is. So I'm trying to think where I have a place I was going to go with this, and I'm not sure where I kind of lost track of my thought on this, but what is the shift that happened? Like, what is the specific thing that you think made this turn away?
Yeah, I don't know if I could put my finger on just one thing. I think a huge part of the kind of the unfortunate effects of the Enlightenment is this naturalistic, mechanistic, godless view of the universe as a closed system that can be fully explained by scientific and naturalistic mechanisms, and thinking of the universe as a machine rather than realizing that we live in a magical world full of angels and demons. Right. I think that's a huge part of it. One of the things that ancient civilizations and human societies throughout time have had in common is an awareness of the divine. It might be a Hindu society where they believed in hundreds of gods, a Greek society where they believed in this pantheon of deities, or it might be a monotheistic society like ancient Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Regardless, there was an awareness that we live in a magical world, and that the spiritual world is real, and that the spiritual and the physical are overlapping, and that the affections of the human person are to be rightly ordered in view of transcendent realities. And the Enlightenment really stripped all of that away. Yeah. Not every participant in the Enlightenment wanted to do that, intended to do that. I think this is where we could be generous and charitable and say that sometimes people have contributed to this degradation of civilization unwittingly.
Right.
But that is, I think, inarguably the result of the Enlightenment, the fruit of the Enlightenment. You basically don't have organized atheism in the ancient world. You have some people who play with types of atheism.
Sure.
You have some Greek philosophers who are atheistic. You don't have systematically, institutionally atheistic societies. And you say, well, that's because they're backward and they're superstitious. It's like, no, it's because they saw the world better than moderns do. They actually saw the world as it is. They didn't see it through the lens that the Enlightenment had handed to them, where now you're putting on the glasses with a filter and you see everything through naturalistic categories.
Yeah, later in the book, Lewis will talk about the inability for the naturalists or the innovators, kind of what he's calling them, but to move from what is to what ought.
Right.
What ought to be.
Right.
And the word ought, I would propose to be one of the most important words in this book,
Yep.
and is repeated all the time. You know, Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought.
Right.
And yet the Enlightenment really did remove any possibility of discussion of oughtness.
Right.
There is nothing. There is no backstop behind
Yes.
the physical material world, which provides some sort of direction beyond just what is to what ought to be.
Yeah, you and I were talking recently. We don't have to get into the specifics of the conversation, but we were talking about a movie that, shocker, one of us liked it, one of us didn't like. Normally it's the other way around, though. This was a film that I actually really liked,
Right.
thought was really good, and that you hated,
Yeah.
like really strongly. And yet the very reason it was interesting, because we're gonna have to watch it together, right? The very reason that I found it compelling was in some ways the reason that you didn't like it.
Right.
But it's built upon a common assumption that common that we share, that even in our entertainment needs to align with those things that we ought to like and dislike, right? And that whole idea is just, it's mindless babble to so much of the modern world, is to say, who is to say what I ought to like? What I like what I like.
Yeah.
I dislike what I dislike. It's like,
I feel.
yeah, it's my truth. You've
right.
got nothing to say about this. And you say, no. That there are things, again, like the chocolate and vanilla ice cream thing, right? There are things that we could have that conversation, but we're talking about approving, loving, affirming, promoting, embracing those things that are good, true, beautiful, and rejecting and abhorring and discarding those things that are not. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's happened, unfortunately, it wasn't in the Enlightenment per se, although I think it really did begin in the radical Enlightenment with certain types of entertainment there that became extremely perverse, is entertainment even began to reflect this disordered affection, so that you have movies where there's no good guy, right? And there's no truth. Right. That is being affirmed, that is being demonstrated. And that doesn't mean that all stories have to be simple. Obviously, a lot of stories are great stories are very complex, right? Morally complex, philosophically complex. But they need to be aligning with the proper ordering of the affections. And if they're not, then they're actually contributing to the disorder of our affections. We're liking the wrong things. We're embracing the wrong things. And so...
Yeah, this is a mistake that some Christians make with their ideas of what movies should be, that they should have no sin or vileness in them at all, right?
Right.
And it's like, no. Like, really what's important is just that it's put in its right light.
Exactly.
That wickedness is seen as wickedness.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So even if, you could, even in a movie or a book, a story of any sort, the good guy might die and the bad guy might win.
Yeah.
And so that in itself doesn't make it a bad movie.
Right.
It's only a bad movie if you leave thinking that was a good thing.
Right. Glorifying the wrong outcome.
Exactly, right. So, but if you leave feeling that injustice and knowing that it was an injustice, actually that movie did something right.
You're supposed to read Mark 6 and the execution of John the Baptist with grief and hatred. You're supposed to, right? Because in that scene, the bad guy appears to prevail, and the good guy appears to tragically die. That's supposed to hit you at a deep level, And if you can laugh at that scene, like something's morally broken inside of you. So
Lewis, in all of this discussion, he's been hinting at things over and over again, but he kind of on page 18 begins to turn the corner and address them more directly. He talks about the Chinese also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing called the Tao. And it's the reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself, which I wrote nonsense as soon as I read in the mark. There was no before the Creator himself.
That's right.
But he's getting at a point here. He wouldn't agree with that either.
Correct.
But it is nature, it is the way, the road. And he goes on and talks about this conception in all of its forms, whether it be Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, Oriental. There is across all of these different cultures some diametrically opposed on very important issues, and I don't think Lewis is trying to skate over that at all.
Right.
But what he is saying is that at the base there is a recognition across all of these cultures throughout world history that there is an immutable reality that we did not make, that we do not change by our feelings, which we are subject to and should submit to.
That's right. It's not determined by human culture, and it is not subject to the changes in human culture and society. And this is going to be our discussion in part 2. So much of it is about the Tao. But I think it's really important what you just said, and that is that it would be an easy mistake to make, and I think it would be a serious mistake to read Lewis as minimizing the very important differences between these different traditions, or doing some kind of moral equivocation to say, well, it doesn't matter whether you're a Confucian or a Hindu or a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian. Right. We all basically believe the same things. And it's like, no, that's not what Lewis believed. And that is a gross misunderstanding of what's actually going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would a Christian, how would we, in more theological terms, talk about what Lewis is talking about right here? How would we define this?
I mean, we would talk about God's moral law, which is revealed both in terms of natural law,
right,
that being present in the human consciousness, his moral consciousness,
written on the heart,
upon the heart, Romans 2:14 and 15. The sensus divinitatis that Calvin identifies, right, the sense of the divine that we suppress by our unrighteousness, Romans chapter 1. But it is also specially revealed in the prophets and apostles, the person of Christ, the pages of Scripture. It is revealed with a particular clarity. We get into that more in part 2, in that special revelation. But it's the same law. It's the same reality. It's the same truth. And whether we refer to it as law, which I think we would rightly as Christians, but even some of these other traditions, not necessarily using that terminology, but they're speaking to the same thing. Yeah. That we have a correspondence view of truth. That truth is that which corresponds to what is real, to what is. Right. And that these are realities, right? That thou shalt not murder. That's the way things are.
Yeah. That's
the way things are. You say, well, that's an ought, right? And it's the way things are. That you ought not to murder, right? And that those things are as real and immutable as what people want to call natural laws today, the law of gravity.
Right.
Probably a bit of a misnomer there. That's a different conversation. But
sure.
But regardless, here's God has established certain norms, certain realities, certain immutable truths, and some of those are moral.
Yeah. Well, it's been said that the second law of thermodynamics, for instance, is one of the most firmly established scientific laws, right? That's just irrefutable. And I'm not trying to refute that. I don't have a problem kind of saying it like that. And yet, Christians will say that the moral law far and away blows away the laws of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, because those things actually don't have to exist.
Correct.
Because they are created realities. And yet the moral law is uncreated in that it reflects the very immutable nature of God.
You're tempting me to get on an ethical jag here, and I'm going to resist that temptation. But I will say one thing: not only do those moral laws not have to exist, but they clearly do. We know that they do because God told us they did. Mm-hmm. God didn't tell us about the law of gravity. We observed it. We described it. Fast forward 500 years, hopefully, we're going to have a better ability to describe what's actually going on with gravity, right? The second law of thermodynamics, we observe it, we describe it. Do we fully understand it? I don't think so, right? Has God dropped a pamphlet or a how-to manual for physics to help us understand these things? No, he hasn't, right? We're figuring this out as we go. The moral law, he actually has done that. He actually has spoken these laws and said, don't miss this one. Thou shalt not murder.
Right.
Thou shalt not commit adultery.
Yeah.
Thou shalt not steal.
Yeah.
Right? This is the law. And that's another reason that the moral law is superior to what people think of as natural laws, right, which are only observational and descriptive. And I'm not disputing that they're realities.
Sure, right.
I'm just saying that our observation and description has only reached so far.
Yeah. And
the moral law we actually have from the mouth of God, from the finger of God, clarity with regard to those issues.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
Could I point something out here?
Please.
We've gone over an hour and a half, and we are at least 8 or 9 pages from the end of part 1.
This is why I told you we needed to just stick to part 1 and try to do more than that.
We did have a little bit of a... I wouldn't say it was an argument. I would say that it was a... What in the world are you talking about, right? It was an incredulous conversation with one another about how far we were going to get.
Well, let's kick it into high gear a little bit,
right,
and kind of try to get to a wrap on the first section, because there's 3 main sections of the book. So let's go ahead and hit a few more highlights.
Great.
And then bring it to a close. One of the things on page 21 that I love is Lewis says that when a Roman father told his son that it was a sweet and seemly thing to die for his country, he believed what he said. This is a really important theme in this book, and then again, when we get to the next section, we'll kind of come back to this idea. But there's a far cry of difference between training the next generation to believe and feel and think a certain way because you believe that it's objectively right to do so.
Exactly.
Versus simply expedient.
And just to underline that, he was communicating to the son an emotion which he himself shared and which he believed to be in accord with the value which his judgment discerned in noble death. In other words, there is this objective reality, the nobility, right, the virtue of dying well, dying for your country. That's objectively a fact. And the father believes that value. He embraces it. And he's now communicating it to his son. And hypocrisy just doesn't work. Hypocrisy does not communicate well, right? Actually, it communicates super effectively. It just doesn't communicate the values that supposedly you're wanting to communicate, right?
Page 24, Lewis is imagining a situation in which it's necessary to send men into battle.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, in battle, it is not syllogisms that will keep the reluctant nerves and muscles to their post in the third hour of the bombardment. The crudest sentimentalism, such as Gaius and Titius would wince at about a flag or a country or a regiment, will be of more use.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, under the Green Book's philosophy, right, it is fitting and sweet to die for one's country.
Right.
Off the table.
Yeah.
You can't meaningfully tell people that because that doesn't mean anything, they would say,
right?
And yet, just simply saying, hey, listen, 2/3 of our regiment has to go out on the field and die in the next 30 minutes. And if we don't do that, we're going to lose today.
The line. That's right.
So I need, just give yourselves up and like that kind of like, who's going to volunteer?
And understanding that Lewis is writing out of experience here.
That's right.
Right. He has been to the front in World War I.
Yeah.
He has bled, right, in service to his country, in service to truth. And that's exactly right. Chesterton says that some men fight because they hate what is in front of them, and others fight because they love what is behind them. And it's very, very clear that one of these is superior to the other. One of these lasts. One of these keeps you in the fight longer, right? And helps you fight with virtue.
So he says the head rules the belly through the chest. And this comes back to what we mentioned early on, men without chests.
Right.
What
What
Lewis
does that mean?
is talking about is the idea of the heart, the sentiment. So without this idea of being able to inculcate just sentiments, that it really is sweet, it is really appropriate, is sweet and good and right to die for one's country, to lay down your life for those whom you love, your brothers in arms, your family at home. Without that idea, you're never going to get these kind of results. And because all man would default to is one of two things without the heart, without sentiment. Either this kind of cold, rational, mechanical kind of person, right, who's just all logic, all syllogism, right? Or this guttural, instinctual, animalistic kind of person, right? Yes. And in the odd thing, or interesting thing, is that in both of those cases of the head and the gut, it'll look out for number one every time.
Right.
Because both of those mechanisms alone, so to speak, will always preserve the self.
Yep. They're inadequate to inculcate and apply virtue. Inadequate. Not that they're contrary at all, but inadequate to hold the line. And it's that, what he calls the chest magnanimity sentiment core that keeps the cerebral man and the visceral man in balance, right? Aristotle, forgive me, but I'm reading a lot of Aristotle right now. He talks in Nicomachean Ethics about the idea of, proportionality in justice, right? And the idea of the mean between extremes being such an important part of justice. And I see some of that in what Lewis is saying here.
Yeah, absolutely.
That it's not to say that we don't need the intellect, we don't need the gut, but it's to say the chest is what's holding it together, right? Yeah. You can't put your head on top of your belly.
Yes, it's the mediator between those two, right? You do. I mean, it's appropriate to have the fight or flight instincts, right? That's an important part of who we are, because we are, though we are rational animals, right? We are animals,
yes.
And yet we have this something other actually stand as the judge between the head and the gut and say it's time to follow this one and not the other.
Right. Yes. Yeah, a persevering devotion to truth, a nice sense of intellectual honor cannot be long maintained without the aid of sentiment. Yeah, I mean, that's an important idea. It is not excess of thought, but defect of fertile and generous emotion that marks them out.
And so what we have in the Green Book, and what we have, I would say, to the umpteenth power since then in our modern educational realm, is we have completely cut the heart out of young men and young women.
Yeah.
And all they are left with is either cold, dead rationalism, which I think that had its time and its heyday, and I think the heyday is gone.
Oh, it's gone.
I think it's completely animalistic impulse at this point.
Look at the explosion of pornography.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, I mean, we could go on and on and on, but I mean, like, we're not thinking noble thoughts. We're not thinking deep thoughts here, right? We're acting like the beasts that our science teachers have said for multiple generations now that we actually are.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but here's the crux. Here's the real issue, right? There still come these moments where it's obvious we need someone to be brave. Right. We may need someone to give their life. We may need to stand up against some great evil or injustice, right? And who's going to do it?
Right.
Who's going to do it under everything we've taught them, everything we've shown them in their movies and their televisions and their lousy books, if they even bother to read books, and they're scrolling through the internet. Who's going to do this based off of what we've given them? And this is how Lewis finishes this section.
Yep.
He said, in a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chest and expect of them to be virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst, we castrate and bid the geldings to be fruitful.
Yep.
That's exactly what we have done and are continuing to do. And this is exactly why, ladies and gentlemen, you need to educate your children with believers.
Correct.
Either you and your family
Yep.
at a homeschool or a classical Christian school.
Get your kids out of public school.
Yeah, absolutely. It is high and way past time.
It's way
for
past
that.
time.
And I'm going to recommend a book just real quick. But it came out very recently. And it is the I'm still going to say
Talking about Hegseth's?
Yeah,
The Battle for the American Mind.
The Battle for the American Mind. Thank you. I always, it fails me when I need it. But the Battle for the American Mind. And ironically, I'm going to say this. It's not the best written book as far as, I think we just talked about as far as like good, well-written literature.
Sorry, Pete.
Sorry, brother. But the information should convince you that the time to get your kids out of the public school system was about 100 years ago.
Yeah, it was years ago. Yeah, get them out of public school, and whether that's a classical Christian school, whether that is a non-classical Christian school for that matter, whether that is a homeschool, it's a co-op, it's a church option, parochial school. You've got to understand that education is more than teaching them multiplication tables and subject-verb agreement, because they're not learning that in the public schools, and they're learning a lot of other things that are very toxic, sinister, and soul-destroying. Yeah. It's a powerful, powerful section. So, we spent almost 2 hours on part 1. There's 2 more parts, brother. Part 2 is my favorite. Any final thoughts as we wrap up here?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think that Lewis said it well enough. But just be encouraged that there are still great resources for giving your kids a world-class Christian education.
It's easier now than it's ever been.
That's absolutely. And if you're actually saying, you know what, I need to think about this more, reach out to us.
Yep, absolutely.
Be more than happy to talk to you and help you find what you need to move that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. We're on Twitter. Our email is readily available. All of that will be in the description to this episode. Education is either building men or abolishing men. And get a copy of this book if you've never read it. It's less than 100 pages. I think it still counts as a book, right? It's really substantive. It's kind of borderline length, but it's very accessible, and read it. And I think, I don't want to spoil or commit, but I think we're coming back to this next episode.
Yeah, let's do it.
Absolutely. All right. So, Jacob, it's been fun. Always enjoy it, brother. Glad to be back at it. Thanks for your patience as we had a break over the holiday and New Year, and looking forward to launching more episodes this new year and doing it pretty consistently, going through a lot of great literature. Absolutely. So until next time,
take up and read.
The Tolle Lege Podcast is produced, filmed, and edited by Elijah Ellis. Music composed by Eric Welch. Copyright The Tolle Lege Podcast, 2022.
It is done, but death can't hold you, no, it won't hold you. Death can't hold you in that grave, no, death can't hold you.